In a research lab, a machine learning system was given access to something almost nobody outside a small circle of scholars ever gets to touch directly: high-resolution scans of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the oldest religious and historical texts ever recovered, hidden in caves for nearly 2,000 years before a shepherd stumbled onto them by accident in 1947. The AI was not looking for meaning in the words themselves. It was looking for something far stranger. Structural patterns hidden underneath the text, spacing irregularities, letter frequency anomalies, sequences that should be random but were not. When the results came back, several historians who reviewed them did not expect to be unsettled, but they were. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are, and why scholars have spent 70 years obsessing over every fragment. Discovered in caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran along the shores of the Dead Sea, the scrolls contain some of the earliest known copies of Hebrew scripture, along with previously unknown religious texts, community rules, and writings from a mysterious sect believed to have lived in near total isolation. For decades, only a small group of scholars had direct access to the physical scrolls, and reconstruction of damaged fragments was done largely by hand, an incredibly slow and error-prone process. Many fragments remained undeciphered or misplaced within their original documents simply because no human could piece together thousands of tiny pieces of decayed parchment with total accuracy. This is where the AI enters the story, and where things get genuinely interesting before they get strange. Modern digitization projects used multispectral imaging to reveal text invisible to the naked eye. Ink faded by centuries, suddenly readable again, under specific light wavelengths. Machine learning models were then trained to recognize handwriting styles, allowing researchers to determine which scribes wrote which sections, something previously impossible to know with confidence. This alone was a legitimate historic breakthrough, no speculation required. But then researchers pushed the AI further, asking it to analyze the underlying structure of certain scroll sections purely from a statistical standpoint, independent of religious or linguistic interpretation. And that is when the model began flagging something odd in specific portions of the text: recurring letter spacing patterns that did not match natural writing rhythm, numerical regularities in how certain words and phrases were distributed across passages, patterns similar in structure to what some researchers have previously described in controversial equidistant letter sequence studies, but this time surfacing in scroll fragments never previously analyzed this way, using far more rigorous statistical methods than the debunked Bible code claims of the past. Here's where the story splits into genuine scholarly disagreement. Some experts argue this is simply the natural result of formulaic, ancient scribal practices. Since religious texts were often copied using strict structural conventions meant to preserve accuracy, which could easily create the appearance of intentional patterning where none exists, this is a completely reasonable and widely respected position within the field. Ancient scribes were meticulous, and meticulous copying naturally produces statistical regularity. But a smaller and more provocative group of researchers noticed something harder to dismiss. In certain flagged sections, the recurring patterns did not just reflect scribal consistency. They seemed to cluster suspiciously around specific theologically significant passages, almost as if certain scribes were embedding structural emphasis intentionally into passages considered sacred or prophetic. If true, this would suggest an additional layer of intentional design within these ancient texts that modern scholarship had never previously identified, hidden not in secret messages predicting the future, but in deliberate literary architecture meant to highlight meaning through structure itself. A practice historians say would align with what we know about ancient scribal reverence for sacred text. This is the part that reportedly shocked several historians reviewing the findings, not because it suggested some hidden prophecy or secret message waiting to be unlocked, but because it hinted that these ancient scribes were using text structuring techniques far more sophisticated than modern scholarship had given them credit for, blending meaning and mathematics in a way that had gone completely unnoticed for 2,000 years, simply because no human being could realistically detect such subtle statistical patterns across such enormous amounts of ancient text without computational assistance. Skeptics were quick to raise a valid and important concern, the same concern that eventually undid the original Bible code craze decades ago, that with a large enough body of text, sophisticated pattern recognition algorithms will almost always find something that appears meaningful purely by chance, a statistical inevitability rather than evidence of intentional design. Researchers behind this specific study say they accounted for this by running control comparisons against structurally similar non-sacred, ancient texts from the same time period and found the clustering pattern to be significantly weaker in those control texts. This does not prove intentional design beyond doubt, but it does make the dismissive explanation considerably harder to fully accept. So where does that leave us with the Dead Sea Scrolls today? We are left with a genuinely open scholarly question, not a hidden prophecy, not a secret code predicting modern events, but something arguably more fascinating: the possibility that ancient scribes embedded layered structural meaning into sacred texts, using techniques so subtle that it took a modern artificial intelligence system, analyzing patterns invisible to the human eye, across thousands of fragments, to even notice they might be there at all. Whether this turns out to be an extraordinary rediscovery of ancient literary sophistication, or simply an artifact of formulaic scribal tradition amplified by pattern-seeking algorithms, one thing is certain: our oldest religious texts still have secrets left to give up, and it took modern technology built thousands of years after these scrolls were sealed away in a cave to even begin asking the right questions about them. There is another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed outside academic circles, and it involves just how much of the Dead Sea Scrolls collection remains genuinely incomplete. Of the roughly 900 documents recovered from the Qumran caves, a significant portion exists only as fragments, some no larger than a fingernail, scattered across thousands of individual pieces that scholars have spent decades trying to physically reassemble like the world's most historically important jigsaw puzzle. Before AI-assisted reconstruction, this process relied almost entirely on visual matching by human eyes, comparing handwriting style, parchment texture, and fiber patterns fragment by fragment. It is estimated that even after 70 years of work, some fragments may never be correctly placed, simply due to the sheer scale of the puzzle and the physical deterioration of the material itself. This incompleteness matters enormously for the hidden pattern debate, because it means the structural anomalies flagged by the AI could theoretically shift once additional fragments are correctly placed within their original documents. A pattern that appears statistically significant today could either strengthen or completely dissolve once missing pieces are restored to their proper context. Some researchers see this as a reason for caution, arguing it is premature to draw conclusions about intentional scribal design from an incomplete text. Others argue the opposite, that the fact these patterns already appear, this consistent even within incomplete reconstructions, makes the underlying signal even more compelling, since missing fragments would be expected to weaken a pattern caused purely by chance, not necessarily strengthen one caused by deliberate structure. It is also worth addressing why this particular finding landed so differently within the historical community compared to previous fringe claims about coded messages in ancient scripture. The difference comes down to methodology and humility. The researchers involved did not claim to have decoded a hidden prophecy or uncovered secret knowledge waiting to be unlocked. Their claim was far more restrained and, in many ways, far more interesting. That certain scribes may have used structural techniques to visually and rhythmically emphasize theologically important passages during the physical act of copying, similar to how a modern writer might use repetition, spacing, or formatting to draw attention to an important line without changing the actual words. If true, this would not rewrite the meaning of the scrolls. It would simply reveal an additional artistic and reverential layer within how they were physically constructed, one entirely lost to modern readers until a machine capable of processing subtle statistical relationships across massive amounts of ancient text came along to notice it. That distinction matters because it keeps this discovery grounded in legitimate historical inquiry rather than sensationalized mysticism, which is exactly why serious historians engaged with it seriously instead of dismissing it outright, the way earlier coded Bible claims were dismissed. It also opens the door to an entirely new field of inquiry, using AI-assisted statistical analysis not to search for hidden prophecies, but to better understand the craftsmanship, reverence, and intention embedded in how ancient scribes physically produced sacred texts. A question historians previously had no reliable tool to even begin answering. So here's the question worth sitting with. If ancient scribes really were encoding deeper meaning into the very structure of their sacred texts, what else might be hidden in plain sight within historical documents we assume we have already fully understood? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if uncovering the hidden layers behind humanity's oldest mysteries is something you want more of, subscribe, because this is only the beginning of what these ancient records still have to reveal.